From the Dialogue of St. Catherine of Siena, The Value of Suffering in Achieving Salvation, a Treatise of Divine Providence. Sections 1. How a soul, elevated by desire of the honor of God and of the salvation of her neighbors, exercising herself in humble prayer, after she had seen the union of the soul, through love, with God, asked of God for requests. 2. How the desire of this soul grew when God showed her the neediness of the world. 3. How finite works are not sufficient for punishment or recompense without the perpetual affection of love. 4. How desire and contrition of heart satisfies, both for the guilt and the penalty in oneself and in others, and how sometimes it satisfies for the guilt only and not the penalty. 5. How very pleasing to God is the willing desire to suffer for Him. The value of suffering in achieving salvation. A Treatise of Divine Providence describes how God teaches St. Catherine of Siena about the value of suffering in achieving salvation. First, God emphasizes that suffering in this life is insufficient to punish even the smallest sin because it is finite. Because God is infinite, an offense against Him requires infinite satisfaction. However, the soul can offer infinite satisfaction by uniting with God through love and a desire to suffer for the salvation of others. This is because God desires infinite love and grief from His creatures. When a soul is united to God by love and desires to suffer for the sake of others, every pain receives infinite merit, even though her works are finite. Example: if a person suffers a headache, the pain itself does not satisfy God. But if that person unites their pain to the infinite love of God and offers it for the salvation of souls, then that suffering has infinite value in the eyes of God. God emphasizes that the desire to suffer must come from love and contrition of heart. Love for God. The soul suffers because she sees the offenses committed against Him, and she grieves because she loves Him. Contrition. The soul understands God's goodness and recognizes her own sinfulness and unworthiness. God reveals to St. Catherine that He satisfies the sins of others through the love, suffering, and prayers of His servants. This is especially true for those who humbly receive the teachings of God's servants. God draws souls back to Himself in many ways, but ultimately He can only remit both the guilt and penalty of sin if the person is properly disposed to receive His mercy. Example: a person might have committed many sins and might not even be aware of the state of their soul. But through the prayers and sacrifices of another soul united to God, that person might begin to feel the pangs of conscience. God might allow them to experience suffering so that they recognize the instability of the world. They might also come into contact with holy people and feel drawn to a life of virtue. However, in order to receive forgiveness of their sins and avoid punishment, they must use their free will to cooperate with God's grace, recognizing their own sinfulness and turning back to God with love. God also reveals to St. Catherine that He is pleased by the desire to bear pain and fatigue for the salvation of souls because it shows love for Him. The more the soul endures for love of God, the more she shows her love, and the more she comes to know God's truth. Knowing God's truth increases the soul's grief over the offenses committed against Him. This grief leads to a greater desire to suffer for the salvation of souls. Finally, God emphasizes that the love of divine charity and perfect patience are inseparable. The soul who chooses to love God must also choose to endure suffering patiently for the sake of His honor and the salvation of souls. Without patience proven through suffering, no soul can be a spouse of God's truth. Example: a wife might show her love for her husband in many ways. By preparing meals, by taking care of the home, by raising their children well, and by spending time with him. However, if she constantly complains about these tasks, her love is imperfect. If she loves her husband perfectly, she will joyfully embrace these sacrifices and patiently endure any suffering involved because she recognizes that her sacrifices contribute to the good of her husband. In a similar way, if a soul truly loves God, she will patiently endure any suffering she encounters, uniting it to God's love and offering it for the salvation of souls. In summary, God teaches St. Catherine that suffering has value when it is united to his infinite love and offered for the salvation of souls. Through the prayers, suffering, and love of his servants, God draws souls to himself, offering them light and the opportunity to repent and turn back to him. However, to receive the fullness of God's mercy, each soul must cooperate with God's grace and make a free choice to love and serve him. What role does suffering play in achieving salvation, according to the Treatise on Divine Providence? The excerpt from a Treatise on Divine Providence describes St. Catherine of Siena's dialogue with God about the role of suffering in achieving salvation. God explains that suffering is valuable when it is united with love for God and offered for the salvation of souls. Suffering in itself has no value in the eyes of God. God makes it clear that even intense physical suffering cannot satisfy for even the smallest sin because it is finite. God, on the other hand, is infinite, and an offense against him requires infinite satisfaction. Suffering becomes valuable when it is united to God's infinite love and offered for the salvation of souls. God explains that the soul achieves this by understanding his goodness, recognizing her own sinfulness, and choosing to suffer patiently out of love for him. When a soul is properly disposed, God can apply the merits of this suffering to others, especially those who humbly receive the teachings of God's servants. He does this by opening their hearts to grace, awakening their consciences, and helping them to see the emptiness of worldly things. The goal is to help these souls turn back to God so that they can receive forgiveness of their sins and ultimately achieve salvation. According to the extracts, God does not desire suffering for its own sake. However, he allows suffering in order to draw us closer to himself. He also uses the suffering of those united to him to draw others to himself. When we understand the value of suffering in God's plan, we can embrace it with love and patience, knowing that God will use it for our good and the good of others. You can find a PDF version of the dialogue of St. Catherine of Siena on the Internet Archive. Here's a link to the page where you can read or download it, or scan this QR code.